Hello. Special thanks to Onasaver for sponsoring our 90,000 subscriber lightsaber giveaway. All the details that have been commented down below. Our story begins inside the Jedi Council meditation chambers. These chambers were not at the peak of the Jedi Temple. Rather, they were in an undisclosed location inside of the temple. Only Jedi Masters on the Council knew of this location. The room was located under the temple garden, and it was outfitted to feel as if it wasn't located on Coruscant. There was a warm, vibrant heat inside the room, and it could simply transform. The room wasn't typically outfitted with seats, but when the Collective Council came down to the room, the seats could be revealed. Currently, only Grandmaster Yoda was standing in the room. It had been months since his journey to Dagobah, and his encounter with the Force Priestesses and the ghost of Qui-Gon Jinn. The warm heat fell gently onto his shoulders as he stood in the middle of the room. He hadn't been down here for years, potentially before the beginning of the Clone Wars, but not even he was sure. It all blended together into just one blurry reality. The past disappeared from his mind, and he was left in his unsettling present and the future that could destroy it. Yoda thought about what he saw during the visions on Dagobah, and instead of using the seats that hadn't been used in years, he sat in the middle of the room and allowed the Force to flow through him. There was no mention of Qui-Gon in his mind, and Master Jinn's presence was nowhere to be felt. Yoda had to ask Skywalker about his experience with Qui-Gon on Mortis, but Anakin seemed distant and confused about it. Yoda had shut down in the moment when, in reality, he could have encouraged the conversation to continue. He opened his eyes to the sounds of echoes in the Force. This wasn't psychometry, it was something else. He closed his eyes again and he could hear more screams. Yoda jumped up, and when he turned around, it was nighttime inside the temple. He could hear blaster fire and lightsabers, the sounds of clones issuing out orders and Jedi Masters trying to protect their young. Yoda ignited his lightsaber and leapt towards the door. When the doors opened, he looked at an empty hallway. He heard his name called, and when he looked over, he saw Mace Windu running in his direction. The Master of the Order put his hand on his belt and asked what Yoda was doing. He turned to Windu and told him that the temple was under attack. Mace took his lightsaber off of his belt and looked around. He scanned the hallways and asked if Master Yoda was feeling alright. Yoda was able to calm down and he regathered his composure. He looked at Windu and then down both sides of the hallways. His lightsaber was deignited and he turned towards the door of the meditation chamber. He told Mace that perhaps he was having a bad vision. Windu asked that he tell him about it, and Yoda nodded his head as they walked in. For Windu, he feared what Yoda had been going through. He was not just a good friend, but a mentor. Yoda taught every single master on the High Council at one point or another. He may have not been their actual master, but he did teach each of them at least once. Windu was taught more than most of the other council members because he was one of the younger members on the council. As the years went by, Yoda taught the youngling classes more than just once or twice a month. It was what he felt he was supposed to do as Grand Master. Regardless, over the last couple of months, especially since Yoda's trip to Moraband and Dagobah, he'd been kind of off. He was distant and he wasn't as vocal in the council sessions. Not that he was extremely vocal to begin with. Windu didn't want to lose a friend, one of his mentors, but he couldn't latch onto fear. Confronting fear was a destiny of the Jedi. The two of them walked into the center of the room, and Mace pressed a button and a number of small cushioned seats rose from the ground. He sat down on his seat, or at least the one assigned to the Master of the Order, and Yoda sat down at his, which was right next to Mace. Mace asked Yoda what was troubling him, and Yoda expressed through a series of words that he believed the war was coming to an end. But for it to come to an end, it seemed as if the Jedi would face their greatest trial. Not an individual trial, but a collective trial. If the Jedi didn't face it together, then perhaps they would lose everything. Mace asked Yoda what he was suggesting, and Yoda believed that every council member, at the very least, should be brought back to the temple. Mace asked about the Cato Neimoidia and Megiddo campaigns, not to mention Depa Billab's campaign on Kalar. Yoda shook his head and said that if the visions were meant to be real, then perhaps it was best to bring them back. Mace did ask Yoda about what this was doing. It would be giving into fear, it would be rejecting their moral code, and surrendering themselves to a fear that they were not taught to accept. Yoda sat quietly. He pondered for a moment and suggested that even if it were right, then maybe it would be best for the Jedi to learn something. Mace felt terrible for Yoda. He was clearly rambling on and on about something. He wasn't in a clear mindset, and Windu asked Yoda if he would like to rest, and Yoda shook his head. He believed that the council should be collected in this room for a group meditation, and then from there, they could make a collective decision going forward. Mace agreed and told Yoda that he would handle it for him. Windu stood up and started for the door, and then stopped, turning back and asking Yoda what it was that he saw that had him so on edge. Yoda took a deep breath and spoke up.
A tragedy. Betray us the clones will. Our allies turned to enemies.
Yoda looked down with sadness in his eyes, and Windu nodded his head with a lot of confusion. Maybe Yoda was losing his mind. Not that Mace was questioning the visions that Yoda was having, but in all honesty, it had been a while since Yoda was on the front lines with clone troopers. It was a hard thing to believe for them. The clone army simply betraying the Jedi Order? It was unreasonable. The clones were the best troopers the galaxy had ever seen. For a council member, it was hard to believe. All the Jedi on the High Council were especially close with their troopers, or at least they had a bond with them. Like for example, both Ki-Adi-Mundi and Commander Bakura were both Galaxy-class psychos, so they got along great with each other. Kenobi and Cody were pretty much like brothers at this point, just as close as any clone was with another clone. So with that, why would they betray the Jedi? Of course, Mace was unaware that there were other Jedi Masters across the Jedi Order that weren't great to their clones or ever spent time with them on the front lines. A great example was General Krell. The stories from Umbara made their way around both the Grand Army of the Republic and the Jedi Temple. But Mace found it hard to believe that one isolated incident could turn the clones against the Republic and the Jedi. Mace was about to call the Council to Coruscant, most specifically Mundi and Plo, considering Depa hadn't departed yet, but he was caught up in the largest attack on Coruscant in over a millennia. The Separatists in a daring move attacked the capital city, the Galactic Republic. It did cost them. While they were able to successfully capture Chancellor Palpatine, they lost him, and Count Dooku was slain by Anakin Skywalker. The battle was won by the Republic and the Chancellor was returned to the Republic Executive Building, safely, which is all that really mattered. The Council was brought back to Coruscant, though there was a switch-up that kinda derailed their plans. Because of the Chancellor deeming Anakin Skywalker as a representative for the Chancellor on the Jedi Council, they reluctantly had to accept his conditions. Per the Council tradition, to go into the meditation chambers and complete the legitimate meditation with the Force, each and every Council member must be adequately prepared for the journey into the Force. Because Anakin Skywalker was the youngest member on the Council in the history of the Order, and not a Master, the Jedi Council had to make a decision. While they rejected Palpatine wholeheartedly and they didn't agree to the terms, they had to accept it. They also needed to make a decision regarding Anakin and the tradition of the Council. Because the Council held their code and their traditions in such high regard, they decided that upon Anakin's appointment into the Council, he would become a Jedi Master, and he would accompany them into the meditation. Though, he would have to be taught how to participate in such a meditation. So Plo Koon nominated himself to do it, since he was so well versed with it. Being a Doran and familiar with the Baron Dosages, he was probably the most equipped, aside from Yoda and Shaak Ti, to handle this. When Anakin came to the Council chambers after the Council was informed of the move, they welcomed him. There was some obvious tension in the room, but the Council expressed, through Mace Windu, that Anakin was being accepted into the High Council. Windu paused for a moment, and Anakin looked confused and almost worried. Would he be again disappointed by the actions of the Council? In all fairness, Anakin wasn't the most trustworthy of Jedi, but he hoped that they wouldn't think about that in this process. Windu told Anakin that the Collective Council agreed that he'd be sworn in as a Jedi Master. He expressed that, out of the two ways to become a Jedi Master, Anakin technically completed one of them. While he did finish Ahsoka's training, she didn't become a Knight. That wasn't the one he completed. Anakin's show skill in the rescue of the Chancellor and Jedi Master Obi-Wan Kenobi was something that should be applauded. Anakin felt a bit of guilt for this. While he was always at odds with the Jedi way, executing Dooku felt a bit too far, even for him. He almost saw himself as a fraudulent Jedi Master in this case, but as he was thinking through this, Mace Windu and Yoda stood up and requested that Anakin kneel to the ground. A knighting ceremony was different than a master ceremony, and this particular one was special because Anakin was the youngest master on the High Council, being a couple years younger than Mace Windu when he joined the ranks of the Council. Anakin looked up at the Jedi who stood before him, and Mace told him to repeat after him, and Anakin did.
I shall not be ignorant, for there is my knowledge.
I shall not be ignorant, for there is my knowledge.
I shall not use passion, for I have my serenity.
I shall not use passion, for I have my serenity.
I will not create chaos. I shall sow harmony.
I will not create chaos. I shall sow harmony.
As a Jedi Master, I shall represent my order and protect my brothers and sisters.
As a Jedi Master, I shall represent my order and protect my brothers and sisters.
Rise, young Skywalker, Jedi Master of the High Council.
When Anakin got to his feet, his smile radiated from cheek to cheek. He hadn't had nightmares about the death of Padme, but he had always wanted this. No matter his issues with the Jedi, which he had many of, he really wanted to be on the Council and have the rank of Master. Maybe for Anakin it was to prove all of his bullies wrong, or it was just an obsession for power. But regardless, he had it. Anakin rose to his feet and smiled at the two Jedi. Yoda and Mace bowed respectfully, and Anakin mirrored them. The two sat down, and before Anakin could take a seat, Windu informed him that the Council was preparing to partake in a ritual. which, because he was on the council, he was required to follow. Master Plo would be educating him in the process for it. The ritual would begin in the coming hours. Anakin was quite taken aback, and he visually showed it with his reaction. Plo Koon had already returned. Mundi was going to be arriving in the coming hours. Master Plo stood up and walked to the center of the room next to Anakin and bowed. Skywalker did the same, and they exited the room, and Plo began the basic instruction. It wouldn't take a whole lot to learn. It was more or less the procedure in the process that might be a little daunting to Anakin. To meditate with the Council would require Anakin to fully open himself up to the Force, which meant revealing every secret within him. The Council wouldn't be able to effectively tackle the group meditation if he wasn't open to the Force. He needed oneness with himself and the Force. Obviously, there was more that Plo needed to tell Anakin, so he kind of just brushed past that, not thinking it would be all that big of a deal for Anakin to trust the Force. Not like he had any career-ending secret sitting in his arsenal. Inside the council chambers, the council members continued their conversation. They talked about the potential threat of Grievous and the Separatists. What they were doing wasn't exactly insubordination, but it potentially could be damaging to the war effort. This wasn't to say the Jedi believed that they were the reason they won battles, because that certainly wasn't the case. More or less, the council didn't want their troopers to feel like they were being ditched at the last second. Yoda then informed the council of his visions and how he knew the Force was always in motion, but the realism of these visions left him feeling that what was to come could rip apart everything. He didn't want that, and he was trying to avoid being fearful, but there was no way to just avoid being fearful of this. No matter how old or young, they were still sentient, and as a council member, it was their responsibility to protect their order. No matter what happened or the circumstances presented in front of them, they had to protect the Jedi Order. In the coming hour, Ki-Adi-Mundi would arrive. The Council hoped that in at least 1 or 2 sessions they'd be able to complete the ritual, but the overbearing concern was Skywalker. He was so rigid, and if he went to the meditation chambers with such a rigid exterior, it could ruin the entire process and set them back, which as the Council believed they didn't have a whole lot of time to be set back on. Plo Koon would eventually tell the Council that the time was right. The Jedi all got themselves into their ceremonial robes and lifted the hoods above their heads and moved as a procession to the meditation chambers. Because Plo and Anakin were already down there, they flanked the sides of the doors. Plo told Anakin where to sit and everything, so once the Jedi Council collectively made their way down to the hallway, they proceeded in. Plo Koon and Anakin turned to each other and followed the procession into the room. The council members each made their way to their seats and sat down. A small pit had opened up and Windu lit the flame in the middle of the chambers and told the council that they would begin. The room activated in a bright light and the floor turned on. Anakin watched in awe as the warm color of the room faded and the blinds were closed. The room slowly became dark and then the floor illuminated. From each seat connected a small line of light that trailed from the seat to the middle of the room. From there, each line connected to each seat. The Jedi were to cement themselves to their seat and to the Force. Once they did, then they would connect with each other. The connection could not be broken. Anakin for the first time had to make a decision that could ruin his chances at remaining a Jedi Master, or even a Jedi in general. As the council mellowed down into their meditation, Anakin convinced himself that he wasn't married and pretended that he didn't know that his wife was pregnant, or his not wife. He was actively trying to plug holes around his mind and his heart, but one cannot simply lie to the Force. It did not work like that, and as the meditation began, it was clear to the other, more experienced members that something was wrong. Now, in all fairness, it could be a number of Jedi from the Council. While Plo and Yoda instructed the new members of the ritual, it didn't mean that everyone would get it first try. The last time the ritual was done, as Yoda quickly remembered, was before Yaddle died. It had been nearly 13 years or so, as it turns out, Sifo Dyas was a member of the Council during that previous ritual. Regardless, those who were struggling with it could be Coleman Kaj, Kit Fisto, Shak T, Straz Ali, Agan Kolar, Obi-Wan, or of course Anakin. The last time they tried this ritual, it did fail because Sifo Dyas' visions could not be seen by anybody else. Truthfully, it'd be much more difficult to do, especially because of the war going on. The darkness disrupted the light, and for each Jedi it made their ritual extremely difficult, as it was with Sifo Dyas. The council pressed forward into their meditation. The collective group got around to Yoda's vision, but there was still a block. Pieces of the vision became visible, but for Anakin, he couldn't even lock onto it. He was seeing so much stuff he didn't understand. He could see Plo Koon's Jedi Master. It was some sort of Wookiee Jedi. He could see Mace training Deppa, and Obi-Wan working with Qui-Gon. There was Stacey Tin, Agan Kolar, Kit Fisto, and Mace Windu working together on copious missions. He could see Shak Ti and her experiences on Kamino, and then of course there was Yoda, standing in a hall with unrecognizable faces, wearing nearly white robes with a golden edge across it. What an elegant look for a more peaceful time. The council wasn't able to see much aside from what Yoda experienced earlier in the day. his experience with the sound of terror and screaming, the sounds of clones and blaster fire, but none of it made any sense. Though for Anakin, something was eerily painful. It was the fact that he recognized one of the voices of one of the clone troopers. It was Sergeant Appo, well, now Commander. But that was his voice. When the meditation ended, the council didn't move. Ceremonially, they had to sit there as if they were in the council chambers and discuss, which is what they did. Mace then made a mention that whoever was blocking themselves off from the Force needed to let go and release what it was they were afraid of being known to those around them. Everyone did know it was Anakin. Before the meditation began, they weren't positive, and no one wanted to blame him off the bat. But with the meditation completed, at the moment, they knew exactly who it was. The point being made is that Mace didn't want to directly call out Anakin in the moment. He wanted Anakin to feel as if he could be open with the council so they could continue the meditation. It was necessary. He was a Jedi Master now, and he had to trust those he served with on the council. As the council began the discussion and meditation, the answers became kind of clear, but it wasn't easy to tell. The main thing they collectively got was the sounds they heard and the name of the clone, which was revealed through Anakin's part of the vision. This did leave a certain unease because it meant that Anakin's men were responsible for some sort of attack inside the temple. The council took a 5-minute recess so they could stand up for a moment before they could begin the second leg of the meditation. Of course, these meditations didn't have to be multiple parts. It was just until the council got what they were searching for, or just gave up, like in the case with Sifo Dyas. Plo Koon walked across the chambers to Anakin and asked him what he was holding back. Anakin looked at the Jedi Master and didn't say a word. He was still holding on to something. Plo didn't put him down, he just placed his hand on Anakin's shoulder and told him, "Let go." By this point, Anakin was truthfully tired. He'd been from the pickup of Ahsoka to the Battle of Coruscant and his appointment to the Council within the span of a day. He might as well make this process a little easier for everyone, including himself. The Jedi moved back to their seats and the meditation began again. In true Jedi fashion, they all slowly mellowed into their own respective habits and became one with the cosmic force that sat between each and every single one of them. It was rigid, difficult, and stiff for Anakin, but as he mellowed in, he listened to Plo's words and let go. The weight on his shoulders diminished and he let himself relax into the group meditation. Skywalker opened himself up and the Jedi could finally see past his barriers. He was the last member on the council to fully open themselves up to the Force, and the moment he did, the vision began and the Jedi went in deeper. Though the vision for the collective council was like chasing a loth wolf, it could only be found when the moment was right, and into the Force the council went. The vision itself transferred to each master, and the collective members had to chase a vision like a ghost. Deeper into the Force they went. The visions, the sounds, the terror, they could all feel it, but it constantly evaded them. It was like the Dark Lord the Sith was manifesting himself through one of the council members to thwart their attempts to understand what it was. But the dark side never triumphs, as is the will of the Force. The Jedi were able to reach the conclusion inside of Anakin's mind. They came to what they were looking for. It was a march on the temple. A hooded figure walked with the clones, though he did not lead them. He walked from behind them. Men with blue, gray, and red marched up towards the temple, and from there, war was complete. It was the loss and destruction and the death of everything they loved. What did it cost them? What could they do to stop it? Was it already too late? The meditation ended and the Jedi were hit with a volt of the Force. Like someone who was with them was instantly thrown from the collective meditation. The lights on the floor faded and the fire died out, without explanation. On the walls, everything lifted and the lights were revealed. The warmness of the room returned and the Jedi all looked at each other. A concern rippled through each of their faces, including Anakin's, though not a single one of the masters believed the man from the vision to be Anakin Skywalker. Sure, the robes were dark, like his, but it wasn't Anakin. Not for nothing, Skywalker wasn't a coward and he wouldn't stand at the back of the lines. The Jedi believed the Dark Lord the Sith was operating against them in real time, and he was likely actively trying to throw them off of his scent. Yoda stood up and told the collective council that they had to be ready for anything. If they could, then they should. Mace turned and asked what Yoda was proposing. Yoda suggested that the temple should become a fortress. It was not common, but it was equipped to become a fortress. In the time being, the council was dismissed. It was the early morning. The council had been in meditation for a little more than 12 hours. Anakin made his way to Padme's residence and arrived at the beginning of the sunrise. It was a late sunrise, and when he did arrive, Padme asked where he'd been and if he was doing alright. She tried to get into contact with him, but he just didn't answer. He was exhausted and he sat himself down on the couch in the living room. She came over to see the worry on his face. The scent of her perfume was such a perfect relaxer. He mellowed out a little bit and told her about the visions and the meditation. While they were talking, he mentioned that the council likely knew of their relationship, and he was anxious about it, but none of the council members said anything to him before he left. Padme assured him that it wouldn't be a big deal. They probably didn't know, and he fell asleep on the couch next to her, with those being the final words he heard before sleeping. Padme had some business to attend to, and the council across the city did too. While a number of council members were sleeping, Yoda and Shakti were not. They were up in the council chambers talking. They both obviously had talked about the main vision, Mace Windu, Stacey Tin, and Plo Koon had just left the room, having completed the conversation. They were chatting until silence fell onto them. They both had the same thoughts, but neither of them wanted to say it, until Yoda asked her if she felt what he felt within young Skywalker. She turned her head ever so slightly and said that Senator Amidala was pregnant. Yoda nodded his head and let out a deep sigh. Shakti asked Yoda what they were to do about it. She suggested that while the code forbade it, Anakin seemed to handle himself quite well for having a hard time learning to accept letting go of his emotions. Yoda nodded his head and agreed, but the Jedi weren't supposed to be like that. He said he sensed a lot of Qui-Gon's legacy within Skywalker. Obi-Wan was definitely not Qui-Gon, but he was close enough for Anakin to pick up on some of his old master's traits. Yoda suggested that maybe they shouldn't concern themselves with it at the moment. Shakti told the Grey Master that she understood where he was coming from, but perhaps there was more to it than just that. The Council could not punish him for it because it clearly took a lot for him to open up and allow that meditation to continue. She also suggested that while the memories of Padme were present, so were the ones of Palpatine, and if he was what the Council believed he was, then perhaps they should be extremely cautious with Skywalker and Palpatine being together. Yoda rubbed his chin and thought. On the other side of the city, Anakin woke up in a cold sweat. He turned to the sound of a speeder, which did wake him up. His heart rate was at a marathon runner's pace, and he turned to see Padme getting out. She smiled and then called him sleepyhead. He had a nightmare, but the sound of the speeder jarred it from his mind. He looked at her and told her he couldn't remember what the nightmare was about. She simply smiled and told him that it probably wasn't anything big, and sat down next to him to ask how he was feeling. He rubbed his eyes, removing a bit of cloudy vision, but upon another rub, he was pretty much blind. What a joke. Anakin spoke up with a raspy voice until it started to slowly clear up. While the two of them were talking, Anakin noticed he had a couple requests from Palpatine to join him at the Opera House, so he told Padme that he had to go and got himself put together. Anakin was very apprehensive about everything. The Jedi knew about his relationship and all of his secrets, so he was worried that they would kick him out of the Order, but the Council made no mention of it. At the same time, he was still here to spy on the Chancellor, which Obi-Wan made him aware of earlier in the day. It was just all a bit odd, but considering Anakin saw the true power of the light, and was after all a Jedi Master, Palpatine talking about Darth Plagueis the Wise was kinda just weird to him. He was also trying to get Anakin to go to Utapau and fight Grievous. Anakin knew he was up to the challenge, but the overarching issue in his mind was what he saw in the vision. It wasn't a positive vision, and he was very distraught over it, over the implications of what actually could take place. Palpatine noticed how Skywalker wasn't accepting his stories and pretty much rejecting all of his attempts. This was frustrating, but Sidious believed that there was so much more to this. He let Skywalker go and decided that he'd be much more forceful with the nightmares he was trying to force onto Anakin. When this coincided with the visions of the execution of Order 66, Anakin began to stress. Though the trouble is, the Force didn't care for Sidious's involvement with Skywalker, so the visions got twisted and Skywalker believed the Sith were going to make a move on the Senate and destroy it. Anakin went to the Council and informed them of his own visions, because he saw this as a continuation of what they collectively experienced. He knew that they knew about his relationship, so just why not be transparent at this point? They knew everything. The Council took the information Skywalker gave them and considered what could be done about it. The sun was beginning to set on Coruscant, and Anakin expressed his concerns for everything. He was honest with the Council and they appreciated the honesty, but at this point, even they were unsure of what could be done. The Jedi began calling back masters from active battlefronts in an attempt to prepare the temple for defense, but at the moment, that seemed as if it wouldn't fix anything. A rocket blasted the temple and the chambers shook. Anakin turned back and ran to the window. The Council all rose within an instant. They looked down and there was a clone army marching up. It looked like the 501st, the Coruscant Guard, and basically any other clone that could get into their ranks. Yoda told everyone that the Clone Wars were coming to an end. He told the Council to get to the Great Hall. Anakin grabbed his lightsaber, and when he turned over to look at Windu, he wasn't moving. Anakin asked what he was doing, and Windu smiled, and told Skywalker he was creating a distraction. The sound of blaster fire filled the air, and it became apparent what was happening. As the collective council got into the elevator, Skywalker watched from the front of the elevator as Windu used the Force to shatter the window. The moment the glass shattered, he launched himself out. An LAAT was flying by and he landed on the wing of it, igniting his lightsaber and dragging it up the side of the vessel, and using the height to propel himself further into the air. The temple was completely blindsided, and the infiltration had begun. There were already a number of clones entering the Great Hall of the temple, as Sindralik and the defense team prepared to protect the temple with their lives. Windu rolled his head back and elegantly sped to the ground. He used the Force to cushion his landing, but he created a massive shock that dispersed a number of clones around him. Windu looked at them as the LAAT he just sliced and diced sped towards the ground, exploding behind him. The clones turned to Mace, though a good portion of them kept running up the stairs. Turns out it wasn't a march. They were sprinting into the temple to attack it and kill all of its members. Windu looked at the clones as they raised their weapons. He deignited his lightsaber and used the Force, propelling himself forward at the clones. His fist smacked into the chest of one of the clones, completely shattering his chest piece and sending the clone backwards. Windu served with so many clones. They were in his mind his closest allies that weren't Jedi. He couldn't harm them. Instead, he'd put them out of the fight. The clone that was hit in the chest dispersed a group of clones around him. The clones turned on Mace and began to open fire. He quickly shuffled between them, throwing his fist into some of them and launching others with the Force. Of course, on the downside, a couple of these clones were killed by their own men, but Mace couldn't stop that. Using the Force was such an asset for Mace Windu, and he dispersed the clones who attacked him. A couple of clones got cheeky and tried hand-to-hand combat, but they were thrown into their brothers and knocked unconscious. Inside the temple, thousands upon thousands of clone troopers entered. There were just too many of them for the initial temple defenses, and the Jedi were helpless. The clones breached without much struggle. Syndralic and a number of temple guards got barricaded inside of a training room, and they had no way out. Even worse for their predicament, one of the temple guards turned on them, and Syndralic was engaged with a Paulan Jedi guard. He was going to be the new Grand Inquisitor in this new empire. Syndralic was far more skilled with a lightsaber though. Outside of the barricaded room, Skywalker and Coleman Cash ran down a hallway to defend a class of younglings. Half the class was missing, and it was already beginning to show the effectiveness of the clones. They were singling out Jedi and hunting them down in squads of 8 or 9. There were just so many more clones in the halls of the temple that the council had to divide and conquer, hopefully conquer. With Windu on the steps, the clones were temporarily being slowed down. Kenobi and Yoda were on the other side of the temple, trying to barricade clones in the hallways, which did work. They stood at the end of hallways, cutting down pillars and trapping about 200 clones or so in a large corridor. The clones were ascending the pillars, but the Jedi were just trying to keep the clones at bay while the younglings, teachers, and everyone else escaped. It wasn't an easy task, but they were working arduously. The collective council was the key to all of this, but Sidious brought double the clones because they barricaded themselves in their chambers. He wanted them all to die. If he could kill them all, with the success of Order 66 galaxy-wide, then perhaps he could claim his new empire sooner. Though he seemed to underestimate the skill of the council, they were the best of the Order, undoubtedly, and they were making his troopers struggle. This wasn't to say the council was stopping thousands of clone troopers with only 10 or so members, because they weren't. The Jedi were ripping their temple apart and using it as a weapon. Fisto, on the other hand, was inside the archives, telling the Jedi to go into hiding and escape from the battlefront. For many Jedi, it was far too late, but for a good number of them, they were able to reroute before they got to the temple. Ahsoka, on the other hand, was with her Mandalorian allies, and they were retreating from the clone troopers on Sundari. Ahsoka and Bo barely escaped. Maul did not. He was executed because the Mandalorians were helping Ahsoka. They were enemies of the Republic, and they were quickly targeted and turned on. Inside of the temple, Saesee Tiin and Agan Kolar brought down a statue onto a couple dozen clone troopers. The clones were fighting with all their best, but once the grunts of the Jedi were out of the way, they were stuck with the temple guards and the Jedi Council. Mace on the steps of the council was throwing clones around, and the rest of them had finally either made it up the stairs into the temple or were completely unconscious. He got there at the end of their assault. After the last clone dropped to the ground, Sidious laughed. He expressed that Mace's powers would have done him so much better on the dark side of the Force. Windu caught his breath. He was tired from the amount of work he just put in. Sidious walked methodically up the stairs. He told the Jedi that he would die. 4 LAAT gunships rolled around and aimed their cannons at Windu. The Jedi Master grabbed his lightsaber and ignited it as they began to encircle him. Sidious smiled and told them to fire, but nothing happened. Sidious looked up to see Grandmaster Yoda falling from the sky and the 4 LAATs having collided into each other. Sidious stepped back and Yoda landed next to his Master of the Order. He was able to get out, thanks to a couple Jedi buying him some time. Sidious was outraged. Had the clones failed that badly? The reality is, they hadn't. The Jedi suffered terrible losses. Most of those inside the temple died. The clones brought all their forces. It just looked like the clones were losing because the Jedi turned the clones into bowling pins. Sidious ignited 2 lightsabers and told the Jedi that he would gut them all himself. He didn't care how many were left inside the galaxy. He would kill every single one of them. Sidious launched himself at the 2 Jedi. Inside the temple, Anakin found a room with younglings in it. He opened the door and was clipped in the shoulder and fell into the room. Coleman Cash turned around, but before he could even remotely defend himself, he was filled with laser bolts. Coleman's dead body fell into the room, and Anakin used the Force to shut the doors. He called over his comm links to see if any other council members were available, but it was radio silent. He feared for the worst. The clones could be heard trying to breach the room. They started pressing the controls and the door slowly opened, not before Skywalker used the Force and launched a third of them into the air. Anakin was extremely skilled, but he was fighting for his life. The clones were incredible men, and they proved themselves to be as such. Kiadimundi, Plo Koon, and Shak Ti on the other side brought the ceiling down on a number of clone troopers, burying those who weren't killed alive. The Mundi was hit by a spare rocket which removed his massive head. Plo and Shaak Ti had to stick together until they met up with a wounded Kit Fisto. He was thrown under a bundle of bookshelves when the archives were bombed. He was limping, but he was fine enough to stand on his own and defend himself. The Jedi knew the temple was lost. The main consensus was to bring each of the members together and escape alive. They only cared about survival. On the steps, Yoda and Mace were throwing their blades against Sidious. Truthfully, for the Sith Lord, using a lightsaber was such a dishonor to the Sith. He believed he would wipe the floor with the Jedi. The whole point of coming here was to see everything fall apart for them. He did believe that Skywalker would survive and join him in his confusion, but that clearly wasn't what happened. He was disappointed with the efforts, but he still believed he could beat the two Jedi. Windu was exhausted, and yet he was still putting up an incredible fight. His use of Shatterpoint and Vapad was really saving him here. Without it, he wouldn't be standing, but he was able to use Sidious's dark nature against him. It also helped that Yoda was taking the brunt of the assault, so Sidious couldn't even focus on Windu alone. Inside the halls of the temple, Shaak Ti, Plo, and Fisto found Skywalker. He was able to defend off the clones, but he was clipped again, this time in the calf. For all of his skills that Anakin had, he still had much to learn, but for a 23-year-old Jedi Master, he was holding his own pretty well, all things considered. He outlived half the Council. Agon Kolar, Stas Ali, and Saesee Tiin by this point had been killed by explosive shells, and while the clones were turned into bowling pins, the Jedi had to escape. Depa was lost early in the battle, but as it turns out, she survived. She was just helping the younglings and Padawans escape, especially considering she was the only member on the Council at the time to have an apprentice. Regardless, the Council members made their way to the hangar bay. The rest of the Jedi had escaped using transportation hidden throughout the city. Obi-Wan met up with his brothers and sisters inside the temple, but he was running away from a conglomerate of clone troopers. Plo Koon told him to go. As he continued running, the clones came across his sights, and he raised his hands and shot from his fingers electric judgment. They wouldn't hurt the clones, but it would impair them. They dropped to the ground one by one, and he turned back. As he did, he ducked, but his mask was clipped by an assortment of blaster fire. Upon the reaction, he threw his lightsaber at a pillar. He was hoping to drop it in front of the clones, but to his dismay, it didn't. Before it crushed the clones, Plo tried to use the Force to stop it, but it didn't work, to his dismay. The sounds of bones crunching was enough to have him leaving in a distraught manner. He could hear the clones on the other side of the pillar, but he turned around and chased after the other Jedi. He got to the hangar bay at the end of a massive battle. The Jedi were able to break through the lines, and luckily for them, Professor Huyang was waiting for them inside a T6 Jedi shuttle. Shaak Ti ran to the cockpit and told Huyang the plan. Plo, Fisto, Kenobi, and Anakin crammed into the back of the vessel with the collection of younglings they had with them. Shaak Ti piloted the ship out of the bay, and the clones opened fire at the back of the vessel. On the temple stairs, Yoda shoved Sidious to the ground, and his hood fell backwards, revealing the face of the Chancellor. Windu's brows firmed, and Yoda stood in disbelief. How could they have not seen this sooner? The two Jedi prepared for their final blow to the Sith when a wing of bombers came barreling towards the temple. The T6 came around the corner, Skywalker on the back cannons as the ship flew right towards the ARC-170s. The distraction was enough for Sidious to get to his feet and try to escape, but that obviously wasn't going to be the case. Once the T6 sped through the wing of bombers, Anakin was able to open fire on the ARC-170s. While the ARCs were equipped with rear cannons, the clones weren't as quick nor precise as Skywalker was. The T6 rolled around and more fighters got in the pursuit. At the same time, Plo ran to the edge of the ship so he could pull the Jedi Masters in as they did their flyby. Though they couldn't. Sidious was engaged with the Jedi. Skywalker's aim was consistent, and his hits landed on the ARC that slid right into the temple steps, right where the three fighters were. The stairs were engulfed in flames, and he let out a terrible no. Did he just kill them? Shaak Ti and Professor Huyang pulled the ship around again, and there was no sight of them. Anakin got up and ran to the ship's bay doors, but Plo was there. He told Anakin they couldn't. He needed to focus. Anakin asked why, and Plo told him what they were going to do was save Padme. Anakin was so confused, but Plo didn't have time to explain. He told Anakin to contact her and get her to the entrance of the residence. Anakin listened and did as he was asked. As Padme walked to the edge of her residence, she could hear the fighters trailing behind the T6. Fisto replaced Anakin on the cannons, and they opened fire on the trailing fighters. By the time they got to Padme, the entire temple was gone. So, even if the Jedi or Sith survived, they'd be killed in the blast. A Venator under Tarkin's command gave the order, assuming Palpatine had evacuated the temple, or that he just wasn't there in general. The issue was all the clones inside the facility perished as well. Tarkin didn't care about that. As the Jedi passed by the residence, Plo and Anakin used the Force to bring Padme into the ship. It was very sudden, but it was successful. Shaak Ti and Huyang piloted the ship into the atmosphere and then into space as they hit the hyperdrive and jumped away from Coruscant. Inside of the T6, Huyang and Shaak Ti came into the back to see if everyone was alright. Fisto stumbled out of the gunner's room and sat down on the small seat. He got some back to into him. Anakin asked the others how many had perished. Huyang was holding a small device and his eyes closed momentarily as he looked up with what seemed to be sadness. He suggested that there were likely 8,000 Jedi killed in the Purge today. The numbers weren't confirmed, especially considering Fisto's message that was sent out, but chances are the numbers were incorrect. Obi-Wan asked if the casualties were higher or lower. Huyang didn't speak for a moment. He said the chances were, based off the statistics and the number of Jedi killed, were likely closer to 9,000 than 7,000. There was a silence in the room. Anakin felt immeasurable guilt for the death of Windu, Yoda, and the Sith. Obviously, he wanted to kill the Sith. But Plo Koon reassured him that it wasn't his fault, and he likely had just brought balance to the Force. The younglings all looked around at each other, and the council members that were all left was Kit Fisto, Obi-Wan, Shakti, Plo Koon, and Anakin Skywalker. Defa Billaba was also alive, and she with the rest of the other survivors were en route to an undisclosed Jedi planet. It was the same one that everyone here was going to. Anakin and Padme spoke to each other quietly, as he explained what was going on, to his understanding, considering how concerning all of this was. The other council members allowed them to do that. It's not that they cared per se, they were just more so concerned with what to do with the Order. They were the leaders of a fallen order. They could only hope that who was left survived, though no one knew. On Coruscant, an emergency session was being called by Bail Organa. While the Jedi didn't know that Palpatine was behind it, the last time he was seen was shortly before the attack on the temple. There was also recordings of him speaking into a hologram, though the sound was muted. The Senate could see that based off the number of clone commanders on holograms, that he was likely behind the extermination of the Jedi. While Masameda was in on the plan, he could see that the collective Senate was not on board with it. Turns out, despite the Jedi's lack of popularity, they became martyrs for essentially being completely destroyed for no reason. No one knew where Senator Amidala was, but the truth is, Palpatine had assisted in the destruction of the Jedi for no reason. Many saw this as a political liability, and tried to figure out how he was able to control the clone troopers, which led to additional pressure being put on the Kaminoans, and shortly after that, a hostile takeover, to understand the nature of everything. On Corvus, the T-6 landed and it was left alone. There wasn't a sight of the other Jedi, and the Council feared for the worst. Padme, through the stress of the past couple hours, was given privacy inside the vessel, so she could give birth to what turned out to be twins. What an endeavor. Outside, the younglings were still as statues, waiting for something to happen. Then the first ship arrived. After that, a second and a third. Most of these carried a couple hundred students. Aside from the Jedi who received Fisto's communication, they began to trickle in. There were so many survivors. They did it. Obviously, they lost a lot, but the Council for a short while was convinced that they were the last of the Jedi. Luckily for them, they survived. While no one knew Palpatine was Sidious, or vice versa, they did see his death on the steps of the temple. And upon Anakin's transmission with Ahsoka, they learned that Maul was killed on Mandalore. Though coming to Corvus was a bundle of survivors from Mandalore, the last of their kind, well, the warriors at least. The clones mass executed thousands of Mandalorian warriors. The civilians were under strict martial law as the Republic tried to sort out the entire situation. Though the war wasn't over yet, General Grievous hadn't been killed without a legitimate battle of Utapau. The Clone Wars would continue and the Senate had to figure out how to handle that without the Jedi around. Luckily for them, the Separatist Council had the collective brainpower as a brick, so aside from Grievous, there wasn't an actual real threat to the Republic. Grievous saw the failure of Coruscant but realized there was potential. Because the Separatist Council was threatening him and he believed Sidious was still alive, he had to listen to their directive. If he didn't believe Sidious was still alive, he would have never listened to them. Essentially, the Separatist Council wanted to target the Kuat drive yards. While this was technically a smart military move, the Council was doing it so it could be beneficial to each of their businesses. They at this point believed the war was over, and so they were preparing to make out like bandits with as much wealth as possible. The hope is that it would go extremely well for them, especially since the Kuat drive yards were a threat to their businesses. General Grievous shocked the Corps when a fleet larger than the one that Coruscant arrived over Kuat. This was the last of everything the Separatists had. Though Grievous was shocked just as everyone else was when they came across a superstar dreadnought called the Pride of the Corps. It wasn't complete, but a majority of its weapons were online and it had terrific shields. The Star Dreadnought was larger than the Malevolence, but Grievous, as a tactician, knew he could defeat it. He was right. The Republic, despite their shipyard and defense platforms, wasn't prepared for the fight here. The Corps, on the other hand, was, because every single available fleet was dispatched to Kuat. The Republic interdictor field, which at this point was in its infancy, deployed around the outer ring of the planet's gravitational field. Once the Republic fleet arrived, the gravity well was turned on, which meant no ship could escape or enter. This forced Grievous to hold his ground after taking out a superstar destroyer and a number of Republic vessels already placed here, along with the defense platforms. It was a very definition of winning the battle but losing the war. Grievous was destroyed and subsequently the Separatist Navy vanished. For months, the Separatist Council would be chased around the stars until they were betrayed by the CIS government from Raxus. They were tired of the conflict and surrendered to the Republic, exposing the Separatist Council and getting Newt Gunray and the rest of its despicable bunch on the executioner's list. The Galactic Senate began its repairs, but there was so much to undo, and without a legitimate chancellor, nothing could be done. Though Tarkin was tried for sedition against the Republic and tossed into military jail. Oh, how the tides had turned. He could appeal, but the chances are he'd be stripped of his rank and forced into prison, which was a death sentence, especially with all the prisoners who hated Republic officers. The Senate had no chancellor, and Masamedo was working as a middle ground, because nothing could be decided on. The Senate was able to put up a false look of control, which allowed the peace talks to begin, but they really had a lot of internal work to do. This happened after the Kaminoans were also tried for betraying the Republic, which they ironically got out of, because, they didn't actually represent the Republic. This didn't stop a band of pissed-off clones from returning to Kamino to execute their creators. On Corvus, the Jedi began the rebuilding process. It wasn't easy, and it forced the Jedi into an unpredictable circumstance. They worked with each other, and they overcame each obstacle. On another note, the words Shaak Ti shared with Yoda allowed her to express his potential input on the entire Skywalker situation. But no one wanted Anakin to feel like he didn't belong. He saved the younglings, and he was more in control with someone in his life rather than without. At least on the surface, that's what it seemed to be. Padme stayed on Corvus with the Jedi because she enjoyed the security she felt. Plus, she had some close friends here like Ahsoka and Obi-Wan. Not to mention her first introduction to Satine's sister. She also noted that they were very similar to each other before Bo-Katan left. The people of Mandalore were given their freedom back, and Bo-Katan returned and collected the Darksaber to take her sister's place and rebuild Mandalore. Jedi Grandmaster Plo Koon and Master of the Order Shaak Ti decided to call Corvus a home because of the Scene Stone. Every other day for the first couple of months, new Jedi would show up, most of them being younglings or Padawans, but every so often, a knight or a master would show up like Jara Tapal with his student Cal and Baylan Skoll. The Order was clearly broken, but they were able to begin their rebuilding process. It wasn't much out here on Corvus, but it was better than nothing. The head count over the months went from what they believed to only be 1,100 survivors to a whopping 3,400 survivors. Out of 10,000 Jedi, these were terrible numbers, but with the initial fears being that only 1,100 Jedi survived, to see that number increase almost on the daily brought peace to a lot of Jedi. Though there was much trauma that had to be undone. While the clones no longer had their inhibitor chips, a lot of Jedi refused to interact with any of the Republic or the clones. The Republic did reach out, and through Padme they were able to speak to Plo and Shaak Ti, but nothing really came of it. The Jedi didn't want reparations. They only wanted peace and for the Republic to do its job for the people of the galaxy. Luke and Leia, the Skywalker twins, would have a chance to join the Order, and while Padme was apprehensive, the Council's demeanor towards Skywalker helped her come to ease with it, especially since the two of them would be permitted to have emotions and interact with their parents in a loving and endearing way. As the Broken Council collected, they believed that while the code should be kept and their traditions be upheld, they should not force it as strictly as they did before. Perhaps the code should be more of a loose guideline for the Jedi to follow, especially as they rebuild. Though the main fear was the rise of darkness, many Jedi faced the fear of light because of what they saw in the Clone Wars and the loss of their order because of it, but the guiding minds of the Council were able to guide those uncertain minds back into a place of serenity. Of course, they would also memorialize those that were lost during the Purge, using the Seeing Stone to guide anyone who was lost back home. As for Ahsoka Tano, Anakin's former student, she would stay on Corvus. While there were several places in the galaxy for her to go to, for potentially the first time, she felt at home here on Corvus with the Jedi. She had her friends and people she cared about, plus how could she leave when Luke and Leia were here? It was her older brother's children, she had to stay here with them. The execution of Order 66 would be a painful lasting effect on the Jedi and the galaxy for generations. Despite the pain it caused, it led to a better uprising for the Jedi and restructuring of what was lost. With the chosen one of the ranks of the Council and the Galactic Republic focused on a rebirth, the galaxy was set for a beautiful future that awaited just ahead. And that, my friends, is our story. Again, special thanks to Galloping Gaming, Tristan, Darth Revan, Pimp Daddy Bane, The Last Jedi, Apollo, Weewoo 670, Azitana, Rai 700, Darth Nox, The Eternal Padawan, Johnny Naguwin, Sans the Skeleton, Jedi Sloth, Mr. Yeet Gamer, Lord Khaled, Youngling Slayer 66, Madman Studios, Anakin 003, Fordo's Legacy Star Wars, Lemon Knight, Rex the Wolf, the man with 3 first names, Dark Saint 46, Baron Joshua, and Lord Deadwing for supporting the channel. If you want that list to get longer and see me mispronounce more names, go check out the Patreon. There's also things for the Sith Clone Wars on the Patreon. Otherwise, I hope you all enjoyed this video. Let's talk about it real quick. So, yeah, I kind of wanted the whole idea of the, not gonna lie, not for nothing, I feel like the whole Anakin versus the Council thing is a little too predictable, and we all know, Anakin's gonna get canned. I don't care that he's the chosen one. The Council kind of gets crapped on a lot, and they're literally the best of the Order, and so, just one or two of them versus Anakin, even Nightfall Anakin, I'm not really seeing him coming out on top of that, and that's kind of too predictable and kind of boring. So I wanted something different to happen here, and I took ideas that have been done before, like what if Anakin got the rank of master, and so on and so forth, and even the what if Anakin never turned to the dark side. But it makes this story feel a lot more natural. It makes it feel like it flows a little bit better than saying, oh, Mace Windu, Agen Kolar, Stacey Tin, and Kit Fisto went to fight Palpatine. They didn't die magically, and then they came back to be here because of Council. So anyways, hope you all enjoyed. I love you all. Spread the love, and always, my friends, may the Force be with you.